Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart composed over 600 immortal masterpieces before dying in absolute poverty at age 35. His name is synonymous with the word genius. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a man who, according to legend, began writing music before learning how to properly write words. His melodies seem simple, light, almost ethereal, as if they were not composed, but simply transcribed under the dictation of God himself. But who really was this man, who lived barely 35 years, but left behind more than 600 works? In this story, we will trace his short but dazzling career. We will discover how a child from the Austrian city of Salzburg became the main sensation of all the royal courts of Europe. We will try to understand what was the secret of his incredible, almost supernatural gift. We will find out why, despite his genius, he struggled almost his entire life against poverty and intrigues, and what mystery surrounds his early death and his burial in a mass grave for the poor. This is not just a story about music. It is the story of a divine gift enclosed in a fragile human shell, a story about the eternal conflict between genius and everyday life. Our tale begins on January 27th, 1756, in the city of Salzburg, Austria. On that day, the seventh child was born into the family of Leopold Mozart, a court violinist and composer in the service of the Archbishop of Salzburg, and they named him Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart. Of the 7 children of Leopold Mozart and Anna Maria, only 2 survived, Wolfgang and his older sister, Maria Anna, whom the family called Nannerl. The father, Leopold Mozart, was a man of his time, educated, incredibly hard-working, ambitious, and at the same time deeply religious. He was not only a good musician, but also an exceptional teacher. His treatise on violin instruction, published the year of Wolfgang's birth, became one of the best in Europe. And he invested all his pedagogical talent, all his energy, into the musical education of his children. It all started with Nannerl. She was a highly gifted pianist, and her father started giving her lessons when she was 7 years old. Wolfgang, at 3 years old, was always present at these lessons. He would sit by the harpsichord, and according to his father's memories, he could spend hours listening with fascination as his sister played, to then approach the instrument and try to pick out thirds and harmonies by ear. Leopold Mozart, noticing this incredible interest, jokingly began to teach him simple pieces on the harpsichord. And then something happened that shook the father to the core of his being. The boy did not just repeat. He memorized minuets and other pieces at an incredible speed, often learning them in half an hour. His pitch was absolute, and his musical memory was phenomenal. Already at the age of 4, he began to compose his first small pieces, which his father, with amazement and reverence, wrote down in a music notebook. Leopold Mozart was not only a loving father, but also a pragmatic man. He understood that his son's gift was not just a simple family joy. It was a miracle sent by God, and this miracle had to be shown to the world. And, along the way, it could become a source of fame and, no less importantly, of income for the whole family. In 1762, when Wolfgang was only 6 years old and his sister Nannerl 11, Leopold Mozart organized his first promotional tour. First to Munich, to the court of the Elector of Bavaria, and then to Vienna, the capital of the empire, to the sumptuous Schönbrunn Palace, for an audience with Empress Maria Theresa herself. The performances of the child prodigies caused a sensation. Imagine the scene. In a luxurious salon, bathed in candlelight, before an aristocracy dressed in silks and diamonds, sits a tiny 6-year-old boy with a powdered wig and a gold-embroidered tailcoat. His feet barely reach the pedals, and he, with incredible ease and virtuosity, plays the most complex works on the harpsichord and the violin. But that was not all. Leopold Mozart put on a real show. He blindfolded Wolfgang, and he played blind. They covered the keyboard with a cloth, and he played without seeing the keys. They gave him unknown sheet music, and he sight-read them without a single mistake. He improvised on a given theme. The audience was ecstatic. It seemed impossible, supernatural. After the triumph in Vienna, Leopold Mozart understood that he had to seize the moment and organized a grandiose 3-year tour across Europe: Germany, Belgium, France, England, Holland. The Mozart family practically lived in a carriage, traveling from one city to another, from one royal court to another. They performed before Louis XV in Versailles, before George III in London. In London, Mozart, at 8 years old, met Johann Christian Bach, son of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, and took lessons with him. In Paris, he published his first sonatas. In Holland, despite the strict prohibition of music during Lent, an exception was made for him, as the clergy decided that this boy's gift came from God. For little Wolfgang, this was not just a series of triumphs, but also an incredibly harsh ordeal. The constant travels in cold carriages, the bad roads, the drafts, the damp rooms in inns. He often got sick, sometimes very seriously, but as soon as he recovered, the tour continued. His childhood was not spent playing with other children, but in endless rehearsals, concerts, and receptions. He grew up in an adult world, in a world of courtly intrigues, flattery, and envy. But his inner world, the world of music, seemed to remain untouched by all that hustle. He continued composing. On the road, in inns, in any free moment. He wrote sonatas, symphonies, arias. Music was born in him as naturally as breathing. It was not a job, it was his essence. And the world, holding its breath, watched the birth of a legend. After the grandiose but exhausting 3-year tour of Northern Europe, the Mozart family briefly returned to their native Salzburg to catch their breath. Wolfgang, who was already 10 years old, was ceasing to be a funny little child prodigy, to become before everyone's eyes a serious and thoughtful young composer. He no longer just amazed audiences with his virtuosity. He was creating his own music. During that time, in the breaks between concerts, in shaky carriages and cold hotel rooms, he had written his first symphonies, oratorios, and numerous sonatas for harpsichord and violin. His father, Leopold Mozart, an ambitious and far-sighted man, understood that for his son's genius to be recognized not just as a freak of nature, but as a serious creative force, he needed to get the approval of the main musical center of the world. He needed to conquer Italy. Italy, in the 18th century, was to any musician what ancient Rome had been to a general. It was the promised land, the Mecca of music, the cradle of opera, the home of the greatest violin masters, the place where the most famous composers and the castrati singers worked, whose voices drove all of Europe crazy. Getting recognition in Italy, managing to get one of his operas performed at the famous La Scala in Milan or at the San Carlo in Naples, was the peak, the limit of any musician's dreams. Leopold Mozart knew that without an Italian triumph, his son would remain a provincial celebrity. At the end of 1769, after careful preparation, Leopold Mozart and Wolfgang, aged 13, left mother and sister at home and embarked on their first, longest, and most important trip to Italy. It was not a simple concert tour. It was a meticulously planned military campaign whose goal was to establish a foothold in the most competitive and prestigious musical scene in the world. Their journey through Italy once again became an uninterrupted series of triumphs, each more incredible than the last. In every city where they stopped, Verona, Milan, Bologna, Florence, the young Mozart gave public concerts that amazed even the most sophisticated audiences. He played the organs in immense and echoing cathedrals, and his music seemed to make the very stone vaults vibrate. He performed in the luxurious and gilded salons of the aristocracy, where his virtuosity provoked a mixture of admiration and envy. He easily participated in musical duels, popular competitions at the time, with the most famous Italian masters, and always emerged victorious, whether in sight reading, improvisation, or the execution of the most complex passages. The most legendary, almost mythical episode of this trip occurred in Rome, in the heart of the Catholic world, during Holy Week. Father and son went to the Sistine Chapel to hear the famous Miserere by the composer Gregorio Allegri. It was a unique, sacred choral work for 9 voices, considered the exclusive property of the Vatican. Its sheet music was strictly guarded, and copying it or taking it out of the chapel was forbidden under penalty of excommunication. It was performed only twice a year, creating an atmosphere of divine mystery. Mozart, after hearing this highly complex 15-minute polyphonic work just once, in complete silence, returned to his rooms. There, by the light of a candle, from memory, from the first to the last note, he transcribed the entire score for the 9 voices. A few days later, he went back to hear the Miserere, carrying the manuscript in his hat to, in the dark, correct by touch some small inaccuracies. When the news of this incredible, almost supernatural act reached Pope Clement XIV, he did not punish the young man for the musical theft. On the contrary, he was so amazed by his genius that he invited him to a personal audience and, as a sign of admiration, awarded him the Order of the Golden Spur. Thus, the 14-year-old boy from Salzburg became a knight of one of the highest papal orders. The next triumph was in Bologna, the main academic and musical center of Italy. There, Mozart met Father Giovanni Battista Martini, the most respected musical theorist and pedagogue of the time, a living legend. To test the young Austrian's genius, Father Martini gave him a task of enormous difficulty: to compose an antiphon, a complex polyphonic piece over a given choral melody. According to the strict rules of the Philharmonic Academy in Bologna, several hours of intense labor in a closed room were allowed for such a job. Mozart solved it in less than half an hour. His solution was flawless. Father Martini, astonished, used all his influence so that Wolfgang, at 14 years old, in an absolute and unprecedented exception, was admitted as a member of this highly prestigious academy. It seemed that all of Italy lay at his feet. They commissioned operas for the theatres of Milan. He wrote them at an incredible, almost inhuman speed, and he himself conducted the premieres, which were a resounding success. But behind this outward brilliance, behind these triumphs, the first and bitter truth of adult life was also hidden. Leopold Mozart, his father and manager, hoped that this overwhelming fame would finally allow him to find for his son a permanent, prestigious, and, above all, well-paid position in one of the Italian courts. He wrote petitions, sought audiences, used all his contacts, but it did not happen. The Italian aristocracy and church hierarchy were delighted with Mozart, the child prodigy, with that funny and brilliant boy in a powdered wig, whom they could show off to their guests as a curiosity. But they were in no rush to permanently and responsibly hire Mozart, the composer, no matter how brilliant he was. Why would they, if they had their own Italian masters, grown-ups, and predictable? They admired him, paid him for one-off performances, gave him gold snuff boxes, but no serious, long-term offers for a court composer position arrived. It was the first big disappointment, the first clash with reality. Leopold Mozart and Wolfgang, despite all their European fame, were still, in essence, wandering musicians, freelancers, dependent on the grace and generosity of temporary patrons. The triumphant journey through Italy, which was supposed to be a springboard to a brilliant and secure career, actually showed them the cruel truth of the musical world. Talent alone, even a genius one, was not enough. You needed contacts, intrigues, and above all, luck. After almost 3 years in Italy, they were forced to return to their native, quiet, and provincial Salzburg. They returned, covered in glory, recognized throughout Europe, turned into knights of papal orders and members of prestigious academies, but without a stable job and without clear prospects. The era of childhood miracles was coming to an end. Adulthood was beginning, in which genius would have to face envy, misunderstanding, and the humiliating need to serve those who were not worth a single one of his notes. The return to Salzburg, after 3 years of Italian triumphs, was for the 17-year-old Mozart like returning to a cage, even if it was a golden cage. After the splendor of Milan, Rome, and Naples, after the enthusiastic ovations in the opera houses and the compliments of cardinals and dukes, the quiet and provincial Salzburg seemed incredibly boring and narrow to him. But there was no choice. The family needed money, and the only source of stable income could only be a position at the court of the Archbishop of Salzburg. Shortly after their return, the old Archbishop Schrattenbach, who had been benevolent to the Mozarts, died. His place is taken by a new ruler, Count Hieronymus von Colloredo, and this event proves fatal for Wolfgang. Hieronymus von Colloredo was a man of a new breed, an enlightened absolutist. He was intelligent, energetic, pushed for reforms, encouraged science and education, but at the same time, he He was incredibly authoritarian, arrogant, pedantic, and tolerated no disobedience. He valued order and discipline above all else, and in art he saw not a divine revelation but a pleasant ornament for his court. Of course, he knew of the young Mozart's fame and hired him for the court chapel as concertmaster. But his attitude towards Wolfgang was completely different from that of his previous patrons. To Hieronymus von Colloredo, Mozart was not a genius or a European celebrity. He was simply a servant. Talented, yes, but a servant after all, just like the cooks, the stable boys, and the footmen. He had to wear livery, eat with the servants, and unquestioningly fulfill any musical commission from his lord. The years began that Mozart himself would later call the most humiliating of his life. He, author of dozens of symphonies and operas, member of the Philharmonic Academy in Bologna, Knight of a Papal Order, had to write music on demand, simple and unpretentious minuets for court dances, short masses that, by strict decree of the Archbishop, should not last more than 15 minutes, light serenades to entertain the guests during dinner. Hieronymus von Colloredo did not appreciate or understand the depth and complexity of Mozart's music. Any creative excess, any bold harmony or complex melody was perceived by him as insubordination. Music had to be a pleasant background, not the main event. For Mozart, this was a real torture. His genius, accustomed to freedom and flight, was locked within the narrow limits of court etiquette and the tastes of a single man, no matter how enlightened but limited he was. The tension grew every month. Mozart was suffocating in that atmosphere. He constantly asked the Archbishop for permission to travel to Vienna, to Munich, or to Paris, where he could get new commissions, meet other musicians, simply breathe the air of the great world. But Hieronymus von Colloredo, considering Mozart his property, almost always denied him. He did not want his best musician working for anyone else. The conflict worsened with personal humiliations. The Archbishop could publicly reprimand Mozart for overly complex music. Court officials treated him like a lackey. The position of a court musician in the 18th century, even for the most brilliant, was that of a dependent person with almost no rights. In 1777, after another denial of permission to travel, Mozart, who was already 21 years old, took a desperate step. He handed in his resignation. To the Archbishop, this was unheard of audacity. A servant dared to resign? At first, Hieronymus von Colloredo simply ignored his request, but Mozart was persistent. Finally, after several weeks of humiliating waits, the furious Archbishop accepted his request. Leopold Mozart, his father, was terrified. He, unlike his son, perfectly understood what stable employment meant and what the life of an independent artist was like, full of poverty and uncertainty. But Wolfgang was inflexible. He decided to undertake a grand tour of Europe with his mother, to finally find a new place worthy of his talent. This trip, unlike his triumphant childhood tours, became a series of disappointments. He went to Munich, to Mannheim, to Paris. Everywhere he is received with respect. They admire his talent, but no one offers him a permanent, well-paid position. He was no longer a child prodigy. He was a grown-up composer, one of many looking for their place in the sun. In Paris, he suffered a terrible misfortune. His mother, Anna Maria, died in his arms after a short illness. He is left alone, in a strange, cold, and indifferent city, without money and without clear prospects. During this same period, he also lived his first great personal drama, the unrequited love for the singer Aloysia Weber, who rejected him. Shattered, disappointed, having failed completely, Mozart is forced to make the most humiliating decision for him. He wrote a letter of repentance to his father and asked him to intercede for him, to get the forgiveness of Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo. Leopold Mozart, using all his contacts, managed to reach an agreement. Hieronymus von Colloredo, perhaps understanding that he would not find another musician like him, agreed to readmit Mozart, but this time as court organist, with an even lower salary and even stricter rules. In 1779, Mozart returns to his Salzburg cage. He is dejected, humiliated, but forced to submit. It seems that his dream of a free and independent creative life has completely failed. But it is precisely in this, his darkest period, that a final and unwavering determination matures in him. The determination to break with that world of humiliations, once and for all, no matter the cost. The return to Salzburg in 1779 was not a simple disappointment for the 23-year-old Mozart. It was like a capitulation, the return to a cage from which he had desperately tried to escape. After the brilliance of Paris, the intellectual atmosphere of Mannheim, the tragic but intoxicating freedom he had felt when left alone in the wide world, the routine and humiliating service at the court of Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo seemed unbearable to him. He was once again just a cog in the huge, soulless courtly machinery. He was once again a servant, forced to write music under the orders of his lord and to eat at the same table as the butlers and the cooks. Outwardly, he submitted. He punctually wrote masses, serenades, and divertimentos. But inside, beneath a layer of court etiquette, a true rebellion was brewing. Every note, written for the archbishop, every simple, unpretentious melody demanded of him, seemed to him a concession, a betrayal of his own genius, struggling to get out. He waited. He was just waiting for an excuse, the slightest opportunity to break those golden chains once and for all. And that opportunity presented itself in 1781. Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo, wishing to impress the imperial court, undertook a long official visit to Vienna, and, of course, he took his best musicians with him in his retinue, including Mozart as his main ornament. For Wolfgang, Vienna was like a breath of fresh air after the stale atmosphere of Salzburg. The city lived for music. It sounded everywhere. Every aristocratic palace on the Ringstrasse had its own domestic orchestra that performed the latest symphonies. In the theatres, sumptuous Italian operas were staged that gathered the entire elite of society. Musical evenings and virtuoso competitions were organized in countless salons. Here, talent, virtuosity, and novelty were valued more than lineage. Here Mozart, unlike in conservative and provincial Salzburg, felt in his element. His reputation as a child prodigy had not yet been forgotten, and as soon as it became known that the brilliant Mozart was in town, invitations rained down on him. Counts, princes, ambassadors, the entire Viennese nobility wanted to hear him play. He began performing in the homes of the most influential people in the capital. His keyboard playing caused a sensation. He was not a simple virtuoso. He was an improviser of unprecedented power. They would give him any theme, no matter how complex, and instantly, before the eyes of an amazed audience, he would turn it into a brilliant, complex, polyphonic fantasy. But Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo watched these triumphs with growing irritation. He did not see them as a reason for pride in his court musician, but as blatant insubordination. How dared his servant, who received a salary from him, perform elsewhere without his personal and explicit permission? How dared he accept honors that rightfully belonged to his master? Hieronymus von Colloredo forbade Mozart to accept any invitations and ordered him to remain confined to the archbishop's residence. This was the last straw. The conflict, which had been simmering for years, reached its boiling point. After another humiliating scene in which the archbishop, according to Mozart's own words, in the presence of other servants, called him a scoundrel, a lout, and a snotty brat, Wolfgang makes a final decision. He sat down and wrote an official letter of resignation, this time final and irrevocable. The reaction of the court was, as expected, arrogant. The archbishop's steward, Count Arco, to whom Mozart handed his request, did not even bother to read it. He threw it back at him. Mozart wrote a second, then a third. He was persistent, and so, during his last visit to the office, the Count's patience ran out. As Mozart himself wrote in a famous letter to his father, full of anger and humiliation, Count Arco, after a verbal altercation, kicked him in the rear, literally throwing him out of the office. For Mozart, this kick became a symbol. It was not just the break with a hated master, it was the break with the entire humiliating system of court servitude where genius was valued less than pedigree. At that moment, he was free, absolutely free, but that freedom was bitter. He found himself in a strange and expensive city, without a stable job, without influential patrons, and with very uncertain prospects. He decided to stay in Vienna and try to do what almost no serious composer had dared to do before him, to become an independent artist. To live not from a generous salary of an aristocrat, but from the income of public concerts, the publication of his works, and private lessons. It was an incredibly bold, almost suicidal undertaking in a world where the entire artistic system was based on patronage and sponsorship. His father, Leopold Mozart, upon finding out by letter, felt terrified and desperate. He begged him, demanded, ordered his son to reconsider, to return to Salzburg, to beg the archbishop for forgiveness on his knees. He wrote him furious letters, full of reproaches and bitter prophecies. But Wolfgang was inflexible. For the first time in his life, he was opposing the will of his father, his teacher, his creator. "The heart ennobles a man," he wrote to him in response, "and though I am no count, I perhaps have more honor than many account." The early days in Vienna were incredibly successful for him. He was at the peak of his popularity as a piano virtuoso. All of Vienna wanted to hear the brilliant Mozart. He gave subscription concerts in the homes of the highest nobility, participated in musical duels, and always won, even when his rival was the famous Muzio Clementi, and received generous fees. Emperor Joseph II himself, a great music lover, looked upon him favorably, and wishing to support the development of German opera, commissioned a singspiel in German from him. In this same turbulent and hopeful period, he reconnected with the Weber family, the same whose daughter, the singer Aloysia Weber, had been his unrequited love. Aloysia Weber was already married and had made a successful career in the court opera. But now Mozart's attention turned to her younger sister, Constanze Weber. She did not possess the striking beauty, nor the exceptional musical talent of her sister, but she was cheerful, carefree, lively, and apparently loved him sincerely, without any calculation. Not the genius Mozart, but simply Wolfgang. Mozart falls in love, decides to get married, and this decision provokes a new storm of anger from his father. Leopold Mozart was categorically opposed to this marriage. He did not trust the Weber family. He considered Mrs. Weber a greedy schemer, and Constanze Weber a frivolous and superficial young woman, a gold digger after his famous son. He refused to give his paternal blessing, hoping this would stop Wolfgang. But Wolfgang, having already tasted freedom, went against his father's will in this too. On August 4th, 1782, without waiting for official permission from Salzburg, which Leopold Mozart reluctantly finally sent, but it arrived late, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Constanze Weber were married in secret in Vienna's main cathedral, St. Stephen's Cathedral. That year was a year of absolute triumph for him. His opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio, was received by the audience with incredible enthusiasm. He was the most fashionable and most expensive music teacher in Vienna. His lessons to the daughters of aristocrats cost a fortune. He was a desired guest in the best houses. He was free, in love, and, apparently, incredibly successful. His bold bet on independence had paid off completely, and ahead, he believed, only fame, wealth, and cloudless family happiness awaited him. But the Viennese destiny, capricious and fickle, was already preparing new and much more serious trials for him. The mid-1780s became the true golden age for Mozart, the peak of his fame, a period of an incredible, almost feverish creative boom. It seemed as if the very source of music had overflowed through him, and from his pen, almost without corrections, without agonizing searches, poured one masterpiece after another. He was the absolute and indisputable center of Vienna's musical life. His public concerts, the so-called academies, where he himself performed as a soloist, playing his brilliant new piano concertos, filled the halls. The aristocracy, the merchants, the foreign ambassadors, everyone considered it a duty to attend these evenings. He was not just a musician, he was a sensation. His entry into the Masonic Lodge Charity in 1784 also played a very important role. Freemasonry at that time was not a secret society of conspirators, but rather an elite intellectual club that brought together the most progressive minds of its time. Philosophers, scientists, artists, and aristocrats who shared the ideas of the Enlightenment. Here, Mozart found not only spiritual nourishment and philosophical ideas, which would later be reflected in his The Magic Flute, but also powerful patrons and, no less importantly, generous clients. He was at the peak of his physical and creative powers, and it was in this brief, dazzling period that, in collaboration with a brilliant librettist, he created his 3 greatest operas, which would forever change the history of this genre. His meeting with Lorenzo da Ponte was the meeting of 2 adventurers, 2 rebels. Lorenzo da Ponte, an abbot by title but a poet and adventurer at heart, was a man of incredible talent and dubious reputation. Like Mozart, he had a genius instinct for hot and current topics and knew how to clothe them in a brilliant, witty and lively poetic form. Together, they were an explosive and revolutionary force. Their first collaboration was the opera The Marriage of Figaro. The very choice of the plot was unprecedented audacity. The play by the French playwright Beaumarchais, on which the libretto was based, had been banned by censors in almost all of Europe, including Vienna. It was a biting and witty satire of aristocratic society. The story of how a cunning and intelligent servant, Figaro, deceives his noble but dissolute and somewhat foolish master, the Count of Almaviva, who tries to exercise the right of the Lord with Figaro's bride. Emperor Joseph II, himself an enlightened monarch, had personally banned the performance of the play, considering it too subversive. But Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte resorted to a brilliant trick. They presented themselves before the emperor and offered him not a play, but an opera. Lorenzo da Ponte assured that he had eliminated all the thorniest political moments from the libretto, and Mozart claimed that his music would ennoble the plot so much that not a trace of the satire would remain. The emperor, who adored music and was no stranger to intrigue, after some hesitation gave his permission, perhaps with the secret desire to poke his overly conservative aristocracy. The music Mozart wrote was a true revolution. He did not create a simple collection of pretty arias. He created a continuous musical action, where the music not only illustrated, but revealed the characters, thoughts, and feelings of the figures. Every character, from the Count to the gardener, received their own unique musical language. The premiere of The Marriage of Figaro in Vienna in 1786 was a success, but quite a moderate one. The Viennese aristocracy, seeing themselves reflected in the distorting mirror of this satire, were not delighted. They applauded the music, but the plot left a bitter aftertaste. But the real, resounding, popular triumph awaited the opera in Prague. In Prague, they idolized Mozart. When he arrived there in 1787, he listened with childlike delight as the melodies of Figaro were sung in the streets, how organ grinders played arias from the opera in taverns, how people danced to its minuets at balls. Here everyone talks of nothing but Figaro. They play, blow, sing, and whistle nothing else, he wrote enthusiastically to his friends. Encouraged by this success, the impresario of the Prague theatre immediately commissioned a new opera from him. And Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte, on a wave of inspiration, created what is perhaps the greatest opera of all time, Don Giovanni. Again, they took a classic but highly risky plot, the story of the legendary Spanish seducer, blasphemer, and murderer, who in the end receives his just punishment, dragged to hell by the stone statue of the commendatore he had killed. Mozart wrote the music at a feverish, almost supernatural speed. According to legend, he composed the opera's overture, in which both Don Giovanni's lightness and the commendatore's dark, chilling chords are already heard, on the last night before the premiere, while his wife Constanze Weber gave him punch so he would not fall asleep. The premiere of Don Giovanni in Prague in October 1787 was an absolute and undeniable triumph. The audience was impressed, stunned, conquered. It was not simply a drama giocoso, as stated on the poster. It was an unprecedented combination of sparkling comedy and dark, Gothic tragedy. Light and elegant arias alternated with imposing and chilling ensembles. Mozart explored depths of human psychology, abysses of passion, cynicism, and divine retribution that no one in music had dared to touch before him. It was in this period, at the height of his fame, that the famous legend of his rivalry with Antonio Salieri was born. Antonio Salieri, the emperor's court composer, was one of the most influential figures in Vienna's musical world. He was a talented, hard-working, and successful composer. But unlike Mozart, he was more a master than a genius. The legend, later immortalized by Pushkin in his Little Tragedy and by Milos Forman's brilliant film Amadeus, paints Antonio Salieri as an envious and treacherous villain who, unable to surpass Mozart in talent, ends up poisoning him. In reality, everything was simpler and more complex. Yes, they were rivals for prestigious commissions and productions at the court opera. Yes, Antonio Salieri, like many others, could not help envying Mozart's incredible, almost inhuman gift, which seemed to write his masterpieces as if playing a game. Antonio Salieri, as leader of the Italian party at court, undoubtedly participated in court intrigues and often hindered the productions of Mozart's German operas in Vienna. But he was no villain. He was one of the few who truly understood the magnitude of Mozart's genius. He sincerely admired his music and, after his death, even conducted his works and became one of the teachers to his youngest son, Franz Xaver Süssmayr. The poisoning story is nothing more than a beautiful but tragic myth born of the romantic imagination of the 19th century. The real poison that, slowly but inexorably, poisoned Mozart's life was not Antonio Salieri's envy, but his own financial incompetence and his astonishing extravagance. Despite the enormous fees he received in those years, money did not last. He and Constanze Weber, having escaped provincial poverty, dove headfirst into the temptations of capital city life. Expensive apartments in the center of Vienna, fashionable clothes, servants, gala dinners, a carriage. Mozart loved billiards, gambling, dancing, and good company. He was a genius in music, but an absolutely helpless and naive child when it came to money. He spent without counting. When the initial wave of his frantic popularity in Vienna began to wane and the aristocracy found newer, more fashionable idols, his income from concerts and lessons plummeted. But the habit of a life of luxury remained, and it is here, at the peak of his creative glory, while creating immortal masterpieces, that Mozart begins his slow and humiliating descent into the abyss of debt. His third great opera, with Lorenzo da Ponte, Così fan tutte, a cold and cynical comedy about human relationships, had moderate success in Vienna, but it no longer caused the furor of before. The public's musical tastes were changing, and Mozart, always ahead of his time, with his complex harmonies and deep psychological development, was beginning to fall behind. His music was becoming more complex, deeper, while the public wanted simple, catchy melodies. He was a genius, but he was going out of fashion, and in the capricious and fickle world of Viennese musical life that amounted to a death sentence. The end of the 1780s marked for Mozart the beginning of a slow, painful, but inexorable path toward the abyss. On the surface, everything seemed to be going well. The facade of a successful life had not yet collapsed. In 1787, after the death of the court composer Gluck, Emperor Joseph II finally granted him the much-desired, albeit modest, court position, imperial and royal chamber composer, but it was more of an honorary sinecure than true recognition of his genius. The salary was low, barely 800 florins a year, a sum that barely covered the rent for his expensive apartment in Vienna, and his duties were mostly reduced to composing dance music for court balls and masquerades. Mozart, the author of Don Giovanni, the genius who had explored the darkest and brightest depths of the human soul, had to write simple, unpretentious minuets, contradances, and German dances. With bitter irony, he called this salary too much for what I do, and too little for what I could do. The real blow was the death of his main patron, Emperor Joseph II, in 1790. His successor, Emperor Leopold II, was a pragmatic, calculating man, completely indifferent to art, and to music in particular. He did not like Mozart, considering his music too complex, and him too bold and unreliable. The court intrigues that his rivals had always woven against the upstart Mozart then reached their peak. They stopped inviting him to court, prestigious commissions dried up, and the Viennese aristocracy, always following the fashion and whims of the court, quickly turned their backs on him. Yesterday's idol had gone out of style. Along with the loss of popularity came real, humiliating, and desperate poverty. The family was growing. He and Constanze Weber had children, but most died in infancy. Constanze Weber herself often fell seriously ill, and the expenses for doctors, medicines, and trips to healing spas in Baden were enormous. The Mozarts had to move to increasingly cheaper, colder, and darker apartments on the outskirts of Vienna. The greatest composer of his time, whose music was heard all over Europe, was forced to write desperate and humiliating letters to his friends and brothers of the Masonic Lodge, asking to borrow money. He asked for small sums, 20, 50, 100 florins. He swore it was the last time, that he would shortly receive a new fee and return everything. If you did not have a friend's affection for me, I would not dare ask you for such a large sum. But, knowing your heart, I am sure you will not deny me. He wrote this to his faithful friend, the merchant Michael Puchberg, who on many occasions, like a guardian angel, saved his family from total ruin, sending him money without any hope of getting it back. Added to the financial problems and constant humiliation were serious health issues. Constant stress, frequent malnutrition, and feverish, exhausting work at night undermined his body. He increasingly suffered from bouts of deep depression, alternating with periods of almost manic, unnatural activity. He was tormented by severe headaches and rheumatism that swelled and pained his joints. His face, which we know from his last unfinished portraits, became emaciated. His gaze became anxious and feverish. But even in this, his darkest period, his genius was not extinguished. On the contrary, it burst forth with a final, incredible, and ultimate force. It was in these last 2 years of his life, in a state of extreme poverty, progressive illness, and deep despair, that he created his deepest, most perfect, and enigmatic masterpieces. He wrote his last great symphonies, the opera, the magic flute, and, of course, his mystical and unfinished Requiem. The story of the creation of the Requiem is shrouded in legends that Mozart himself, in his sickly and exalted state, largely helped create. In the summer of 1791, when he was already completely immersed in the work of the magic flute, a mysterious stranger appeared at his home. He was tall, thin, dressed completely in grey from head to toe, and did not give his name. He handed Mozart an anonymous letter, commissioning a mass for the dead, a requiem, and left a considerable advance in gold ducats on the table, promising to pay generously for the finished work. For Mozart, who was in a desperate financial situation, this commission was a true salvation. But its mystical and mysterious atmosphere had an enormous, almost fatal impact on his weakened and tormented psyche. He was convinced that this grey messenger was a herald from the other world, coming for his soul. He was absolutely persuaded that he was not writing this requiem for anyone else but himself, for his own funeral. "I am writing the requiem for myself," he would whisper to his wife, Constanze Weber. "It must not remain unfinished." In reality, everything was much more prosaic. The commission came from an eccentric aristocrat, Count von Walsegg, who was an amateur musician and had the strange habit of commissioning works from famous composers to then transcribe them in his own handwriting and present them in his private concerts as if they were his own. That is why he maintained total anonymity. But Mozart did not know this, and his imagination painted the darkest pictures. He worked on the Requiem with a feverish, almost manic obsession, interrupting himself only to work on other equally urgent commissions. In the fall of 1791, in Prague, on the occasion of the new emperor's coronation, his last serious opera, The Clemency of Titus, premiered with great success, and then, in September, in a small theatre in the suburbs of Vienna, the premiere of his popular Singspiel, The Magic Flute, took place. This fairy tale opera, full of Masonic lodge symbols and brilliant music, was received by the common public with incredible enthusiasm, and finally began to generate good and steady income for him. It seemed that things were improving again, and that the financial abyss on the edge of which he was balancing was beginning to recede. But it was already too late. His health was deteriorating rapidly and irreversibly. At the end of November, after one of the performances of the Magic Flute, he felt so ill that they had to take him home. He would never get up again. The doctors that Constanze Weber was able to call failed to establish an accurate diagnosis. Modern researchers, analyzing the symptoms described in letters and memoirs, suggest that it was acute rheumatic fever, complicated by a streptococcal infection and acute kidney failure. His body swelled so much that he could not turn over in bed. He was tormented by incessant pain and a fever that alternated with chills. But even in that state, bedridden, he continued working mentally on the Requiem. He dictated the notes to his student, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, who hardly left his side. He gathered his musician friends by his bed, and they, barely holding back tears, softly sang to him the parts already finished, while he, lying down, followed the score and made corrections. When they reached the first bars of the Lacrimosa, the Day of Tears, Mozart burst into tears, saying he would never finish that part. He was in a hurry. He knew he barely had time left, and his last and most important battle, the battle against death for his music, was coming to an end. The last days of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart were an agonizing struggle between a fading body and a genius that still burned furiously. He lay in his modest apartment on the Rauhensteingasse, with his body swollen from dropsy and his mind oscillating between flashes of feverish clarity and long periods of delirium. But even in that state, he only thought about music. The score of the Requiem rested beside him on the bed. He went over the pages again and again, making faint annotations, whispering something to his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr, who stayed by his side inseparably, trying to memorize the master's last instructions. His room was almost always full of people. Despite the poverty, he was surrounded by faithful friends, students, and brothers of the Masonic Lodge. They came to support him, to help Constanze Weber, or simply to sit quietly by his bedside, witnessing the fading of the greatest talent of their time. On December 4th, 1791, one day before his death, Mozart's condition seemed to improve for a moment. He was fully conscious. He asked to be brought the score of the Magic Flute, and, lying down, he softly began to hum Papagino's aria, looking at the clock to time the moment when that scene should begin in the theatre. It was his farewell greeting to the world he loved so much. That same evening, he gathered several singer friends by his bed. He handed out the parts of the Requiem to them, and they, barely holding back their sobs, tried to softly perform the sections already written. Mozart himself, lying down, sang the alto part. When they reached the first bars of the Lacrimosa, the Day of Tears, he suddenly burst into tears like a child and put the notes aside. He understood that he would no longer be allowed to finish that music. Towards evening, he worsened. A high fever began. Delirium tossed him around in bed. His lips whispered something soundlessly. His fingers moved as if playing an invisible keyboard. According to the memories of his sister-in-law, Sophie, in his last hours he seemed to try to imitate with his lips the sound of the timpani in his Requiem. That was his last thought. A thought about music. An hour before midnight, on December 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died. He was only 35 years old. His death, like his life, was full of humiliating prose. Constanze Weber, devastated by grief and penniless with 2 young children, could not afford even a modest funeral. The expenses were covered by Baron van Swieten, one of his aristocratic patrons and a Masonic brother, but he arranged a funeral of the cheapest category, the 3rd class. The brief service was held in St. Stephen's Cathedral, but in a small side chapel. To bid farewell to Vienna's greatest composer, only a few of his closest friends came. None of his noble protectors, none of those who until recently applauded him in the salons, attended. After the service, the small coffin with his body was taken to the Street Mark Cemetery, located on the outskirts of the city. According to legend, a terrible snow and rainstorm broke out that day, and none of the mourners made it to the cemetery. But this, most likely, is just a romantic myth. The truth was even simpler and sadder. According to the customs of the time, it was not customary to accompany the deceased to the grave. He was buried as the poor, the vagabonds, and all those who did not have money for their own plot were buried. His body was placed in a common, anonymous mass grave, along with other deceased. No cross, no monument, not even a simple plaque with his name. The exact place where the remains of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart rest is unknown to this day. The greatest genius in the history of music was buried like a pauper. Immediately after his death, it seemed the world would quickly forget him. Yes, the newspapers published brief obituaries. Yes, his friends organized a few concerts in his memory. But Vienna, fickle and capricious, soon found new idols. His overly complex, overly deep music temporarily faded into the background. Constanze Weber, in order to survive, was forced to sell his manuscripts. But true immortality does not come immediately. It comes silently. Little by little, Mozart's students, his friends, the true connoisseurs, began to collect, publish, and perform his music. Beethoven, who in his youth dreamed of being his disciple, bowed to his genius. The romantics of the 19th century, Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, saw in him their god, their unattainable ideal. And the further his short and tragic life receded into the past, the brighter and clearer the scope of his legacy became. It turned out that this small, cheerful, and often frivolous man had created an entire universe. A universe of ideal, pure, and divine beauty. His operas, his symphonies, his concertos, his little night serenades. This music has survived everything. It has survived empires, wars, and revolutions. And it plays today. It plays in the great concert halls and in the small music schools. It plays in the movies, in commercials, on our phones. We live surrounded by his melodies, often without even knowing who their author is. So, what is his main secret? Perhaps it is that his music does not speak to our mind, but directly to our soul. It speaks of the simplest and most important things, of joy, of sadness, of love, of forgiveness, of beauty. It needs no explanations. It simply is. And in its harmony, in its perfection, we find comfort, peace, and a reminder that even in the most imperfect, unjust, and cruel world, there is always a place for divine beauty. The name of Mozart is not just the name of a composer. It is synonymous with music itself, eternal, beautiful, and immortal.